So welcome everyone, I'm James Herbert, the president of the University of New England, and welcome to UNE's annual celebration honoring the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This event is one of the highlights of our academic year here at UNE, and it's my pleasure to see so many familiar faces here, as well as so many guests from away from the region, so thank you for joining us today. This event is also being live streamed to our Portland campus, and we have a number of people watching there. This room is at capacity, so we did an impromptu live stream to another room in this building as well. So we have a lot of people watching. I'd like to offer a very special welcome to our distinguished guest, Dr. Angela Davis. And I've had the privilege of just spending some time with her and speaking, and you're in for a real treat, I'll tell you. But I'm going to refrain from saying too much about her because I'm going to introduce someone in just a few moments who will tell you more about her. But what I would like to do is to say that I'm very deeply honored that Dr. Davis has agreed to join us here, to take the time away to come to Maine and to join us to share her reflections with us. It is such a pleasure to host such a pivotal figure in American history here at UNE. Today we commemorate the historic visit to Maine and to UNE, or at least to one of our precursor institutions at UNE, of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. In May of 1964, Dr. King came to speak at St. Francis College, which was the college that became part of UNE right here on the spot where we sit today. He accepted an invitation from two of St. Francis's professors and shortly later made his only visit to Maine. To put Dr. King's lecture into historical perspective, this was less than a year before his historic I Have a Dream speech in Washington. It occurred during the same year that he won the Nobel Peace Prize and was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. So for sleepy Biddeford, Maine, that was a pretty big deal. The event drew crowds and media as far away as New York City, and people came across the region and descended in Biddeford to hear Dr. King speak, not unlike today, I should add. About 1,000 people crowded into DeCary Hall, the gym, to hear him talk about the importance of civil disobedience and the need to end segregation. By all accounts, Dr. King was extraordinarily generous with his time. He mingled with students both before and after his event. He inspired the people who met him that day, and he continues, of course, to inspire us to this day. We're very proud to carry forward his mission, striving to instill in every UNE student the drive and ability to advocate for equity and justice. Our campus has changed quite a bit since Dr. King's visit, and our institution has changed as well. But our devotion to inclusion and creating a future of diversity and fairness has not wavered. Through the generations, we've built a consistent identity of extending educational opportunities to those marginalized by our imperfect American society. St. Francis College welcomed Franco-Americans at a time when immigrants, and especially the Franco-American community, were often excluded from higher education. And Westbrook Seminary, our precursor institution in Portland, welcomed women when the doors of higher education were otherwise closed to them. In recent years, we have redoubled our efforts to be inclusive. Our new strategic plan, which we just completed after a year-long process, lists a welcoming, inclusive, and vibrant community as one of its 6 core strategic pillars. Last August, we hosted our inaugural Scholars of Color breakfast here in Biddeford. We also recently launched a Muslim Student Association. We've expanded the menu items in our dining hall to be more sensitive to religious dietary restrictions. We've created new rooms on our campus that offer safe, inviting meeting spaces for underrepresented students. So there's a number of things that we're doing, but we still have much more work to be done. And we hope that students that we educate will help create the more inclusive society that we all imagine. So let the wisdom of Dr. King and the righteousness of our cause continue to light our way. It is my pleasure now to introduce Erica Rousseau, who is our Director of Intercultural Student Engagement, who will introduce Dr. Davis. And Erica, thank you very much. Where's Erica? Oh, there she is. Thank you very much, Erica, for organizing this event.
Good afternoon. It is so lovely to see all of you here. This is a great day for UNE. I'm so excited, and I'm so happy that you all came. I will try to keep my comments brief, as I am fully aware that no one came here to listen to me, including myself. I want to thank you all for being here again today, whether you came from across campus, from another town, or from another state. I appreciate all of you gathering here today. In continuing with the spirit of gratitude, I want to express my enormous gratefulness to three people in particular: Jen DeBurrow, Doretha Ben, and Ray Handy. Thank you for your trust and guidance in making this a successful event for our students, faculty, staff, and surrounding community. There is not time to mention everyone, but briefly, to everyone that worked so hard to make this event a success, thank you. Thank you to the people that made tasty sandwiches, who shoveled the snow, who moved furniture, who co-sponsored, who signed contracts, who ensured that we all have accessibility, and who offered to me words of encouragement and support. I thank you. I would like to mark this day as a starting point. I hope that this lecture sparks discussion, thought, and conversation. I want the ideas talked about today to bring about a discourse of open thought. That is how we will truly learn. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, "The time is always right to do the right thing." Through her activism and scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the higher public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities who struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Dr. Angela Davis is the author of 9 books and has lectured throughout the United States, as well in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Dr. Davis has also conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her most recent book is Freedom is a Constant Struggle: Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Dr. Davis has been a role model and hero of mine since a very young age, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce you Dr. Angela Davis. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. It is really wonderful to be here in Maine, in the winter season. But of course, that is when we celebrate the accomplishments, the life and work of
Dr. Martin Luther King. So I am very grateful for the invitation to join you to participate in your celebration today. I thank President James Herbert and, of course, Erica Rousseau of Intercultural Student Engagement. And I understand that they've been working on this event for quite a while. I also understand that this event commemorates the visit Dr. King made to this campus in 1964, am I right? I always like to call attention to the fact that when we observe MLK Day, we not only celebrate the spirit of the civil rights movement, but we celebrate the fact that the declaration of King's birthday as an official holiday, which of course takes place on the third Monday of each January, that this was the outcome of a very long struggle. There was a time when it actually seemed unlikely that we would ever get to set aside a day to reflect on and pay tribute to Dr. King and to all of those who fought a sustained battle to end racial segregation during our country's 20th century freedom movement. The first bill calling for an observance of Dr. King's birthday was submitted in Congress the very same year he was assassinated, in 1968. That bill, and that's an interesting history. Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman elected to Congress, submitted this bill over and over and over again. Finally, in 1983, the bill was signed, and the first celebration took place in 1986. But it wasn't until the year 2000, 19 years ago, that all states observed the holiday. In the meantime, of course, Stevie Wonder wrote and performed Happy Birthday, which has become the official happy birthday song in many households, especially in the black community. 6 million people signed petitions that were submitted by Coretta Scott King. The NFL moved the Super Bowl one year from Phoenix to Pasadena because Arizona refused to recognize MLK Day, and a boycott of Arizona was called. There are precedents to Colin Kaepernick's stance, and there are precedents to boycotting states and governments, I might say. Now, at least once a year, we collectively reflect on the meaning of the historical challenges to racism and their relationship to ongoing struggles against racism and other persisting forms of oppression. So I'm very happy to join you as you engage in this collective reflection. You all know that MLK Day does not simply focus on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his individual accomplishments. MLK Day is about a movement, the Black freedom movement that challenged many forms of racism, primarily in the South, but also called for a more holistic, today we might say intersectional understanding of the nature of racism. This movement led to a deeper consciousness of other forms of oppression and discrimination as well. One of my favorite passages from Dr. King's writing comes from a lecture he gave in Canada some months before he was assassinated. If you want to find it, it is in the collection of lectures entitled trumpet of conscience. But let me share it with you. The first man to die in the American Revolution was a Negro seaman, Crispus Attucks. Before that fateful struggle ended, the institution of absolute monarchy was laid on its deathbed. We may now be in only the initial period of an era of change, as far-reaching in its consequences as the American Revolution. The developed industrial nations of the world cannot remain secure islands of prosperity in a seething sea of poverty. The storm is rising against the privileged minority of the earth, from which there is no shelter in isolation and armament. The storm will not abate until a just distribution of the fruits of the earth enables man everywhere to live in dignity and human decency. And the last sentence of this passage, the American Negro of 1967, like Crispus Attucks, may be the vanguard of a profound, prolonged struggle that may change the shape of the world as billions of deprived shake and transform the earth in their quest for life, freedom, and justice. And I use this passage as a preface to remarks that will revolve around the fact that we are witnessing throughout this country and throughout the world a major uprising of women. In the 21st century, and we're already 2 decades into the 21st century. I can remember when 1984 represented the future. But in this 21st century, we have finally begun to recognize the leadership of women. Social movements like Black Lives Matter are led by women, Black women and queer women. There are more women in Congress now than ever before, including the first Palestinian American woman elected to the House of Representatives. We have finally begun to acknowledge the centrality of what were once marginalized as women's issues, and thus not worthy of general consideration. And so this morning, I want to talk about the various connections between racist violence and gender violence. And I want to begin by recalling that my very first childhood memories are the explosive sounds of racist bombings of a house across the street from where my family lived. And in my memory, I also recall a late night knock on our front door by a woman who was fleeing a man whom I later found out had raped her. In elementary school, I remember whispered conversations about a classmate and friend who had been the target of sexual assault. And I distinctly remember questioning in my own mind why she was assumed to be responsible for that act of sexual violence. Some years later, Emmett Till was lynched because of a putatively sexualized comment to a white woman in the town of Money, Mississippi. And in 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, claiming the lives of 4 beautiful black girls who were just beginning to explore the possibilities of their lives. The movement against gender violence in this country is frequently periodized in connection with the 1966 founding of the National Organization of Women and the creation within NOW of a task force on rape. I certainly do not want to minimize the important work that NOW has done over the years, and I don't want to undermine the importance of the eventual emergence of an anti-rape and anti-violence movement that reflected the work that women associated with organizations like NOW perform. But I want to trouble the way we think about the emergence of the movement against gender violence. You might say, I want to trouble that genealogy. With genealogies, one always chooses a point that is established as the beginning. And oftentimes it's rather arbitrary. If one looks at the genealogy of the anti-violence movement, one can question why the work against sexual violence associated with the civil rights movement, the Southern Black Freedom Movement, came to be so marginalized that it took many years of research and activism to recognize that Rosa Parks was one of the pioneers of that work. And of course, Rosa Parks is recognized as a great figure in the history of this country, but largely only for refusing to move when she was told to move to the back of the bus. And as the legend would have it, she was very tired that day. When she was alive, she made the point that she was not tired at all. And she also liked to say that she was represented as a tired old woman who didn't feel like getting up. She says, I definitely wasn't tired, and I was not old. She was in her 40s, early 40s. Now, I want to say a few words about Rosa Parks. She was involved in the 1930s in the movement to free the Scottsboro Nine. Are you familiar with the case of the Scottsboro Nine? Interestingly, my mother was also involved in that campaign. And I learned about it when I was very young. But these were 9 young black men who were fraudulently charged with raping a white woman. There's a lot of literature available on it if you're interested in pursuing it further. But she was one of the major, she and her husband were major activists, and they had to raise money in secret at that time. she remembers that, quote, "Black men could not hold meetings without fear of bodily injury and death." Now, later, when a carload of white men in a town called Abbeville, Alabama, gang raped a black woman by the name of Reese Taylor, the NAACP sent Rosa Parks. She was one of the leaders of the NAACP in Montgomery. She was sent to investigate that act and to help build a movement. And it's interesting that this was probably the first campaign of its sort. It was characterized by the Chicago Defender as the strongest campaign for equal justice in a decade. And what's interesting is that the Montgomery Improvement Association, which became the organization responsible for coordinating the 1955 boycott in Montgomery, grew out of that effort. But the question I'd like you to ask is why we don't see the relevance of that work to struggles against gender violence more broadly. And why were white women anti-rape activists reluctant to acknowledge how important it might have been early on to cultivate a political consciousness that linked rape to racism? In this context, I would like to share with you a passage from written in 1972, from a letter written in 1972 by Anne Braden, who was a white anti-racist activist in the South, and one of my own mentors. In 1972, she wrote a letter to white Southern women. It was in connection with the case of a young man by the name of Thomas Wansley, who had been, like the Scottsboro Nine several decades before, who had been fraudulently, falsely charged with rape. Anne Braden always envisioned a strong and powerful multiracial women's movement. And she wrote, "We haven't been able to develop that kind of strength because of the deep chasm that divides white women from black in our society. A chasm created by crimes committed in the name of white womanhood. It may seem paradoxical," she wrote, "but in this racist society, we who are white will overcome our oppression as women only when we reject once and for all the privileges conferred on us by our white skin. For the privileges are not real. They are a device through which we are kept under control. We can make a beginning toward building a really strong women's movement as we openly reject and fight racist myths that have kept us divided. We can begin by joining with our black sisters in a campaign to free Thomas Wansley and go on from there to free others and ourselves." As many scholars and activists have pointed out, existing social hierarchies have determined who gets to be a legitimate survivor of gender violence? Who gets to represent those who constitute legitimate victims? Beth Ritchie, who is a scholar activist, a sociologist, has written about the every woman. The every woman who peoples our imaginaries when we think about the possible eruption of gender violence. And she has pointed out that this every woman is actually a racialized construction. Racialized as white. Why is it so difficult to posit Black women, women of color, as exemplary? And this is the question that Tarana Burke asks. And as you know, she was the original creator of Me Too, but who gets credit for it? So my questions are about the connections we make. The experiences of women of color are rich and generative, but why are they considered experiences that relate only to communities of color? Perhaps if it had not been assumed that we had to work with the most general of categories, and perhaps if racist categories were not already presumed to be general or internalized within a presumption of generality, we might have recognized the value of holding on to the specific and the particular. I think this is the lesson that the Black Lives Matter movement has been trying to impart a century and a half after this insight should have become a part of our history. And when I say that, I'm referring to the fact that there have been many controversies surrounding the slogan Black Lives Matter. And as you know, there have been many who've said that we shouldn't say Black Lives Matter, we should say, exactly, all lives matter. As if all lives matter is in opposition to Black Lives Matter. And as if we are denied the opportunity to recognize that democracy in this country is based on the presumption of a few standing in for the many. All people are created equal, but who's really created equal? Perhaps one can say all men are created equal, because we know that women were excluded from the very beginning, right? But then we know that not all men were included, so perhaps we could say, well, all white men are created equal, but then we know that the reference is not even to all white men. It actually is only to affluent white men. So from the very beginning, our presumptions of generality that are inscribed in the Constitution actually refer to a very small minority. But on the other hand, we all know that if ever Black lives were to truly matter in the world, that would be a sign that finally all lives matter. And so we should question why white is the subject of generalization and universalization. Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian American always remain at the level of the particular, that which is not helpful in the production of the category women. But why do we assume, moreover, that disabled women are to be treated as a marginalized category? Especially when we're speaking about violence. Disabled women have a 40% greater risk of intimate violence, as the American Psychological Association has pointed out, especially with severe consequences than their non-disabled sisters. Why are trans women especially if they are Black trans women or trans women of color, why are they always dismissed and demeaned? Why can we not recognize that if we want to eradicate gender violence from our worlds, we have to address the conditions surrounding those who are most subject to violence? Intimate violence, stranger violence, economic violence, state violence. The Human Rights Campaign, which advocates for justice for LGBTQ communities, recently released a report entitled A National Epidemic, Fatal Anti-Transgender Violence in America in 1918. The overwhelming majority of trans women killed were women of color. I mentioned a book earlier by Beth Ritchie, the sociologist, and the title of that book is Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation. Her research points to the pitfalls of assuming that the figure of the middle class, cis, heterosexual white woman should stand in for all targets of gender violence. On the other hand, if one looks at Black women, Black trans women, there are insights to be garnered that would otherwise be unavailable. I have been involved for many years in campaigns against the state violence that we know as imprisonment, campaigns against the prison, and not reformist campaigns, but abolitionist campaigns. And I frequently point out how our work was enhanced by the contributions of trans prisoners who asked us to begin to address questions of the rights of trans people in prison. And out of that work came insights, not only regarding physical, psychological violence, but also ideological and epistemic violence. And we came to recognize that the prison, among the work that it does, it presumably works as a punishment apparatus, but it is also an apparatus that ideologically produces and reproduces the gender binary. Of course, there are men's prisons, right? And then there are women's prisons, and we take that for granted. But what happens to those who don't necessarily identify in a straightforward way with that gender binary? Prisons are gendering apparatuses. Prisons are gendering apparatuses. And so how does our view of gender violence change if we look at it from the vantage point of Black women, indigenous women, the first peoples of this region are much more likely than any other group to be in prison. Because of the assumed privatization of the lives of middle-class white women, and the private sphere is assumed to be a haven of freedom. There have been a number of scholars, Catherine McKinnon and many others, who have examined these contradictions between the public and the private, right? I mean, even our very important constitutional right to abortion based on Roe v. Wade comes from the principle of the right to privacy. But we also have to ask, who has access to privacy? And these are the questions that we often don't raise. If abortion is guaranteed because of a woman's right to privacy between herself and her doctor, what about those women who have no doctors? Right? And who have to rely on government funds for medical care. So you see, there's some major issues here. But the point that I am trying to make is that because of the assumption of privacy, because of what you might call the privatization of the lives of middle-class women, because the private sphere is assumed to be a haven of freedom, then the repressive apparatus can be called upon to secure that freedom. I'm talking about the police and prisons. An analysis that doesn't explore the structural basis of violence can easily rely on carceral methods to address expressions of gender violence. So what I'm trying to do here is to propose a critique of what you might call carceral feminism. Are any of you familiar with carceral feminism? Okay. Well, it assumes that the lives of women can be safeguarded from violence by relying, as I said before, on the police and on imprisonment. But we're talking about institutions of state violence that are supposed to be securing the lives of women who are suffering from other forms of violence, as if there's no relationship between the violences. And through this work, and as a result of the contributions of abolition feminism, so I would suggest that carceral feminism, the problems of carceral feminism are precisely addressed by abolition feminism. Feminism that recognizes the interrelationships between the various forms of violence, and that acknowledges how ridiculous it is to assume that a violent institution such as the prison can solve problems of violence. And people who are sent to prison usually end up becoming more violent during their stay inside these institutions than less. How many of you have seen Dream Hampton's documentary series on R. Kelly? No? Is it because we're in Maine? I think it was shown on Lifetime, if anybody watches TV. You know, it's very, very difficult to watch. It's very difficult to watch. But I think finally it begins to address some of these issues. You see, historically, what we have assumed is that you simply send the perpetrators to prison, and then you don't even have to think about the problem any longer. That is to say, if they do end up in prison. So prisons are a place that allow us to forget about actually solving the problems of violence. It was very difficult to watch, particularly because there were so many women who had been targeted by R. Kelly. But it was also a look at the complex forces that pushed him in the direction of becoming such a monster. And I think that this is a period when we finally have to open our eyes and not try to forget about such issues as sexual violence. The journalist Jim DeRogatis, who did an amazing amount of research with respect to R. Kelly. I mean, the amazing thing is that it was known that R. Kelly was abusing young women for years and years and years, yet he continued to be embraced by the music community. He continued to do his work, and he continued to put music out there, and people were singing, "I Believe I Can Fly." Well, anyway, I wanted to quote something that this journalist said in doing all of this research. He said, "The saddest fact I've learned is nobody matters less to our society than young black women. Nobody." As I move toward the conclusion of my formal presentation, I want to gesture toward links between carcerality and policing on the one hand, and gender violence and the permanence of community violence on the other. This is not simply an issue confronting us here in this country, in our homes, in our communities, or throughout the country. It's a global issue. Gender violence is the most pandemic form of violence in the world. And as a matter of fact, as we confront the current issues, government shutdown, and I try not to mention the name of the occupant of, current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But, you know, all of this talk about building a wall is when many of the people who are trying to come to this country, who are trying to immigrate, are fleeing violence. Often violence that is directly related to the work of US capitalists. and femicide in Central America. Many of the immigrants are women and children who are fleeing gender violence. And the solution is a wall? So I would like us to think internationally, globally, because we've learned how to think of ourselves as the center of the universe. And no matter who we are, if we happen to live in the United States of America, we live at the center of the universe. But that is not the case. As a matter of fact, we suffer from our provincialism and not understanding forces in other parts of the world, and not recognizing, as Dr. King did, that there's a great deal that we can learn from struggles that are unfolding in other parts of the world. I'm thinking about Brazil and the recent assassination of Marielle Franco, who stood up against gender violence and racist police violence and against community violence in Rio de Janeiro. Leyla Güven, who is in prison in Turkey, where she has been on a hunger strike for the last 2 months for speaking out on behalf of the Kurdish people and for calling for an end to Abdullah Öcalan, who is the leader of the Kurdish movement. Razmia Odeh, a Palestinian-American activist who was previously subjected to horrendous forms of sexual violence by the Israeli military. She was deported from the US to Jordan. She lived in Chicago for many years, by the way, and was deported to Jordan. If you're interested in her case, read about it. It is very upsetting because this is a woman who was really dedicated to struggling for democracy, but because she challenged the Israeli government and did organizing, especially in the Palestinian American community in Chicago, she was deported. And I don't know if any of you are aware of the fact that I was recently offered a human rights prize. And several months after they told me that they were going to give me this award, they called me to tell me that they had rescinded it. And I keep asking myself, how is it that I end up at the center of major controversies like this? I don't know. But I will say that this is a very exciting moment because so many people have spoken out against the position of the board of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And let me say that that institution, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institution, is an institution that I want to protect. My Sunday school teacher in Birmingham was the person who, for many, many years, pushed to create the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And my mother was one of the most avid volunteers there. So I don't want to say anything that can be construed to be in opposition to the institution. It is just that there were members of the board, and oftentimes the board members of such organizations are the ones who represent the moneyed communities. They're placed on the board because they're expected to raise money for the organizations, and they have no idea what it is they're doing. And so I think that that board had no idea that the response was going to be more than just a local response. And I cannot tell you how many letters and statements I have received. Those, you may not all be aware of the controversy, but the reason why the award was withdrawn, it has been said to me, is because of my support for justice for Palestine and my critique. And as I was saying, I have received letters and statements from individuals and organizations and huge numbers of Jewish organizations, including most recently an organization of reconstructive rabbis. And so I think this is a very exciting moment. It's an exciting moment because I think we're finally beginning to recognize, as Dr. King always emphasized, that justice is indivisible. He said, "I am not going to be concerned about justice for Negroes. I'm not only going to be concerned about justice for Negroes in the United States because I know that justice is indivisible, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Thank you. So I think we have a short time for questions.
Good afternoon, Dr. Davis. My name is Hugh Magby. I'm from Warren, Maine. I'm sure you're aware that the ex-governor of Maine had said that Black and Hispanic men are the enemy and that armed Mainers have the right to shoot us. He made this statement 2 years ago, and up till now, we haven't seen any movement directly talking about that threat. Could you address how it must feel as a Black person to have that threat over you?
I will answer the question by pointing out that the existing political leadership of this country has created an environment that has brought out all of the worst forms of racism. And we're seeing forms of racism that are really very much linked to the period after slavery that are now erupting once again. And I would answer your question by saying that you need a very vibrant, powerful, strong movement against racism here in Maine. And movements can transform conditions, situations, ideologies, collective attitudes. And I think that it is ordinary people who really are the agents of history. So my response would be, begin to revitalize. I know that you have a lot of anti-racist organizations and movements in Maine. Revitalize them. We need them now more than ever before. Thank you for your question.
What does Palestinian freedom mean, and what will that look like for Israel?
You know, I think that it is, it's up to the Palestinian people to determine for themselves what justice and freedom for Palestinians means. And I know that historically there have been conflicts between what is represented as the one-state solution and the two-state solution. And of course, it's very complicated, but if you look at the map, you see that Palestine has been shrinking. And it has shrunk to practically nothing, particularly if you consider the fact that settlers live inside occupied Palestine and have, I had the opportunity to visit Hebron when I traveled to Palestine not long ago. And I was shocked that there were streets that Palestinians were not allowed to walk down. It reminded me of the Jim Crow South. You know, only, perhaps even worse, streets that Palestinians can't drive down, freeways, highways that are only designated for Jewish citizens of Israel. And I think that my own personal opinion is that the whole notion of democracy has to be revisited. Democracy should not allow for hierarchies. And in the law in Israel, there's a hierarchical relationship between laws that govern people of Jewish descent and laws that govern people of Arab descent. And at the same time, I would argue that we have to beware of the extent to which anti-Semitism can creep into our circles. Anti-Semitism is connected to racism, so any embrace of anti-Semitism is an embrace of racism. So my answer would be that people who live in the area have to figure out how to truly create a democracy where all people are treated with respect and dignity.
Hi. I heard you speak on NPR, I think it was a week ago, and I was really moved about how you were speaking about trans rights, and I think that it's very powerful. I think a lot of times people who have been in movement work for a long time don't evolve, and I guess my question is how important or how do you go about making sure that your movements and your justice and your compass continues to evolve and continues to include all of the different isms that we keep uncovering?
Well, the organizations and the movements have to be intergenerational, multi-generational. And the new ideas inevitably emerge from the younger generations. And personally, I've always tried to remember that. And I tried to remember that when I was young, while I respected my elders, I also knew that as young people, we were the ones who were moving towards the future. And now that I'm older, I still have to remember that. I mean, there's a kind of amnesia that develops sometimes with age, and I try not to capitulate to that amnesia. I try to remind myself that there are new ideas in the world, and those ideas have emerged largely because young people who stand on our shoulders, and we always like to use that metaphor, but if we examine the metaphor, if they're standing on our shoulders, that means that they can see a lot further than we can. And therefore, we have to depend on them. Is that okay?
If you all have class to go to, I cannot write you a note. So please, we will not find it rude if you have to exit. Please do so quietly. Dr. Davis has been so kind as to take 2 more questions. So if you, over here.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. My colleague and I are the presidents of White Coats for Black Lives, so we're medical students. And as you know, the health disparities among black women specifically are unacceptably high. I know this is a very open-ended question, but what advice do you have for future physicians going out into this world?
Well, I think you are probably in a better position to tell me, but I'm so happy to hear that in your field that you're addressing these issues, health disparities, and a whole range of other issues that emerge from the institutionalization of racism. And so I think what I would like to do in answering your question is frame it more broadly so that it does not only refer to the field of medicine, but that it refers to a range of other fields. It's often assumed that one cannot do significant work in opposition to racism because one is situated in a particular place, in a particular job, in a particular arena, and that one has to, in order to be an activist, one has to find the field of activism. And in the imaginary, in people's imaginaries, I don't know, maybe it's in the street somewhere, right? But in reality, racism and all of its linked forms of oppression it has insinuated itself into all of our institutions, and work needs to be done everywhere. No matter who you are, where you are, what you're doing, you can always create an arena of struggle. And I think that it is important to point out that inclusion isn't the last answer. It's not the ultimate solution. We tend to fixate on these terms like diversity and inclusion, and that's all we talk about. And of course, diversity is important, inclusion is important, but even more important, justice. So that we don't end up including previously marginalized groups into a world that remains as racist or as misogynist as it was before the inclusion. So thank you so much for your work.
Hello. I am a young activist, and my family, they worry about me a lot whenever I organize and, create protests and all that stuff. So I wanted to know, how do you deal with, the negativity and the threats that you receive from your activism work? So yeah, that's what I did.
Well, okay. Well, I've experienced a lot of that. And I try to deal with it by making community. And people have often asked me, well, weren't you afraid when you were facing the death penalty? Yes, I was afraid. Of course I was afraid. Weren't you afraid when you did this, and when you did that? And I like the point, and I mention this very frequently, the point that Audre Lorde made, that one does not have to be immobilized by one's fear. We can be afraid, and we can continue to do the work. And the best form of security, I think, is the creation of ever larger communities. If you attempt to do whatever it is you're doing as an individual, by yourself, alone, then you can easily be singled out and targeted. I'll never forget when I was a graduate student at UC San Diego, my professor, who was my major mentor, Herbert Marcuse, who at that time was in his 70s. Well, he seemed old then, but now I'm in my 70s. So. And we were calling for a new institution on the campus, a new college that would serve the needs of Black and Latino and working class poor white students. So we decided that we were going to break into the registrar's office and occupy it. But we knew that if we did it by ourselves, that we would all get kicked out of school. So we went to Professor Marcuse and asked him if he would walk in with us. And of course, he was the most esteemed professor on the campus, and he did. And we not only did we not suffer the consequences that we had feared, but eventually that struggle was relatively successful. We were calling at that time for a college to be named after Patrice Lumumba and Emiliano Zapata. So it was to be called Lumumba Zapata College. The college exists, but it's Thurgood Marshall College. And, I guess my advice is to try to create ever larger circles of community, and tell your family, your parents, that this is the only way the world will change. This is the only way it will change. Thank you very much for your activism, and thank you for attending this event. And I wish you all the success in your own struggles against racism here in Maine.